The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Here's something interesting. NASA space probes have discovered a sort of artificial barrier around the Earth that has been created by human activity. And you're probably thinking along one set of lines, which is where I was thinking when I saw the headline, but it's actually something a little bit different. It turns out that we are impacting the space around the Earth because of this barrier where low-frequency radio communications are interacting with particles in space, and this is creating a sort of shield that's protecting the Earth from some high-energy radiation in space. And this might actually kind of be good news. It's weird because most of what we're doing on our planet is not particularly good for us or for the environment or for outer space or space pollution or whatever. But scientists are saying that this actually might be a good thing because this sort of a protective layer could be used to protect the planet from extreme weather events. You might have heard, Pat, about coronal mass ejections. This is when the sun has like particularly high output in these sort of isolated bursts where plasma and magnetic field are ejected from the sun's corona. This might actually be sort of a good thing for us.
Yeah, it really is fascinating, too, because most of these radio waves are going down towards submarines in the deepest parts of the oceans, and they're getting reflected back into the atmosphere, which is the opposite of what you'd expect. And, you know, because this comes from radio communication, I think that we can say we are actively doing our part to fight against, climate change.
By doing the show, you're saying.
By doing the show,
yeah,
exactly,
because the program is on some radio stations, although you know, those stations would probably still be on even if it weren't broadcasting our show. But I like the way you're thinking. Anything we can even ostensibly take credit for, I think is a really good thing.
It's like if you buy an electric car, right? Instead of a gas vehicle, you're doing your part.
Yeah, you're not necessarily resulting in the production of an additional electric car, but you're at least doing your part to show that there is demand for these cars or something. I'm sort of reaching here, but I like the way you're thinking. Do you think that some years from now, I mean, we're already sort of figuring this out, but at some point in the future, we're going to look back and realize just how even more damaging than we ever thought many of our activities were, right? And I think that this is going to apply with the environment and climate change. This is definitely going to apply to some medical treatments that now are sort of the common medical treatment. And we know that things like, for example, chemotherapy are not good for the body overall, even though it is a way to treat cancer. In the future, we're likely going to look back at much of what we're doing and look at it the way we now look at when, you know, leeches were used or whatever the case may be.
It is unfortunate when we find out that some of the actions that we're taking on Earth is accidentally harming us in some way or fashion. But at least in this scenario, we're able to do something that's good by, you know, protecting from the radiation going around and the space around us. It actually reminded me of an interview that we did a few months ago with a professor who was advocating for solar geoengineering. And he said that we'd be able to, by, I guess, spraying some aerosols into the atmosphere, be able to reflect some of the solar radiation back out into the universe.
Yeah.
So kind of mitigate the effects of having more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
That's right. I mean, even when I hear those ideas, they're obviously interesting ideas, but at the same time, I feel like we will hear those possibilities and then the polluters will basically take license to say, see, I knew we'd figure out a way to undo the damage that we're doing. This gives us license to do even more damage. And that don't you know that big business is going to react that way to some of those advancements?
Yeah, that is true. But I mean, it can't stop you from trying to find solutions to the problem, even though that may create bigger problems down the road. I think you have to stay one step ahead of it. And also, you can try to stop them from doing those harmful acts at the same time.
You can do both things, no doubt about it. Over the weekend, there was a viral video of a girl being dragged into the water by a sea lion in Richmond, British Columbia. And immediately, you saw the video, right,
I saw
Pat?
the video, yeah.
If you haven't seen it, you can check it out. There was a male California sea lion that dragged a girl by her dress and pulled her into the water off Stevenson's docks on Saturday. And the video instantly went viral. And immediately, the family is getting blamed for saying they were careless. These are, after all, wild animals. It doesn't matter that the sea lions are cute. they are still wild animals, and the parents should have sort of been more aware. Sea lions can be deadly. They pose serious health risks. This girl was okay, and parents or adults jumped into the water and got her out. Do you, when you watch it, say the problem here, the only problem, is that somebody allowed the girl to get too close to the sea lions and turn her back to the sea lion?
No, not at all, because she had just sat down. Even if the parents were watching her and able to, make her change her mind and stand up and get away from the dock area.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so quick that I don't think you can blame the parents. There's so many different factors there, right?
Well, but you could make the case that the parents should have never allowed her to get that close in the first place. In other words, if you're around a wild animal, you can make the case that you should be holding your child's hand, for example, and that they never should have been able to get so close to the sea lion in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it is a freak accident, though, and I think that's why you can share the blame across a bunch of different people. But it's interesting how this is the story that keeps reinventing itself in different forms. A few years ago, it was a child that was brought into the ocean in Florida from an alligator.
Right.
And then, of course, we had the Harambe incident in 2015,
Yes,
where
indeed, the gorilla.
a child fell into a gorilla pen or whatever it's called.
If you had been there, would your kid, if you had one, have been allowed to get so close and turn her back to the sea lion in that way? Or do you feel that as a parent, you would have been more attentive and that never would have even become a situation in the first place?
It probably would have happened. Sea lions are just objectively not intimidating looking. I mean, I wouldn't be too afraid if a sea lion came over, And of course, they eat fish and they are mammals, but
yes,
I just wouldn't be too scared.
People see them and they sort of seem to react to humans kind of like a dog. And that often makes it's like when you see a little bear cub and you say, it looks kind of dog-like. It's this little cute thing. It's like a little puppy. But very quickly, some of these animals, number one, have incredible strength. And number two, they are wild animals. They have certain instincts, and it is unpredictable. And I think that this is why the anthropomorphizing of animals through media can make people understate the perceived threat from many animals.
And this is what the officials were saying. They were like, well, you wouldn't just give a grizzly bear a ham sandwich, you wouldn't just offer that over to him because, of course, you recognize that this is a dangerous animal.
Yeah.
But I don't think people have the same perception when it comes to sea lions. They're just too cute and friendly looking.
Yeah, I think you're right. I told you last week, or maybe it was even the week before at this point, about this double murder that took place very close to where I live in Boston. And related to that, over the weekend, a friend of mine told me about the suspected serial killer in Boston that has been apparently around for many, many years, and it may even extend beyond Boston. I had never heard of this, Pat, but I did some research into it. And there was actually another incident over the last 24 hours. Before I tell the audience the details, were you at all aware of this possible serial killer story?
No, I mean, it's certainly a conspiracy theory, but I hadn't heard of this serial killer allegation.
Well, don't jump to conspiracy theory right away, because the research I've done suggests there may be something here. So apparently, there have been for years now a string of sort of young white men in Boston, and also some not in Boston, that the hypothesis is may be connected, where individually these deaths of men turning up, often in bodies of water in and around Boston, were individually written off as this one was a suicide, this one was a freak accident, that one was a suicide, etc. But there are people who, for a while now in the Boston area, have not believed this. They believe that it's always these men who are, they tend to be out late at night, often walking somewhere alone. It's dark. And then they end up, one with a cinder block attached to his leg, in the middle of a not particularly deep pond, which is sort of a weird way to commit suicide. How do you get out into the middle of the pond? It's not a very deep pond. Where did you jump from? Doesn't really make any sense. And apparently this morning there was yet another one of these individuals, young man, found in a body of water. My girlfriend texted me about it. She's very worried because she says, you fit the profile. And I said to her, don't worry, I'm Hispanic. They're only targeting white men, which of course is a crazy thing, right? I mean, I was sort of I didn't know what to say, but I said, don't worry, they're only targeting white men, not Hispanic men. Stupid joke, I know. And I've been reading about it. And yes, now it's more than a conspiracy theory, at least as far as I can tell, Pat. It does appear that there have been a number of these incidents where young white men are turning up dead, often in bodies of water, and police have not reported individual evidence of wrongdoing in many of these cases. this is spreading very, very quickly, and it's starting to mathematically become tougher to believe that this is just happening as a sort of coincidence of individual suicides and accidents because of just the sheer numbers of it.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, when we try to explain that someone with a cinder block attached to him in the middle of a lake was a death ruled by suicide, no one's going to believe that. And it does add up to a point where it's not even a conspiracy anymore. You know,
That's
it gets to a
exactly
point where
my
it's probably
point.
most likely that a serial killer is out there. So I was probably a little bit too quick to write it off.
You jumped the gun, I think,
You know?
no doubt about it. So in the last 7 years, there have been 10 young men found in waterways in and around the city. Now, you might say, well, hold on a second, David. Boston has a population of, 700,000. The Boston area has a population of somewhere between 3 and 4 million people, the metro area. 10 men in 7 years, it doesn't really sound like there's really a trend here. But when you step back for a second and say, well, what is the underlying rate of these types of deaths, suicide, drownings, etc., and compare that to the frequency of this type of death, and when you consider, again, waterways in and around the city, law enforcement individually saying, well, this one was an alcohol-induced death where somebody had an accident. Then there were some that were drug-related accidental drownings. This other one was a suicide, etc. It's not convincing a lot of people. And there are people saying, no, there's something more going on here.
I think you're still within the realm of conspiracies until you get to a point where you have a suspect or a fugitive in mind and that there's a more distinct pattern of the murders there.
Yeah.
Until then, I think it's just Occam's razor. You know, we talked to Michael Shermer last week about this, how conspiracy theories tend to grow because people want a more elaborate explanation for things that are often just very simple. So I'd have to see more evidence before I'm convinced. But I'll be careful out there.
I was just reading an article about Occam's razor, and the interesting thing about Occam's razor is there's a number of iterations of Occam's razor, but basically the very general idea is when there is a simpler hypothesis that explains a phenomenon, you should go towards that one rather than a more complex one, assuming they do an equally good job of explaining it. Now, that's a very crude interpretation. The application of Occam's razor to science, for example, is very different than to, for example, politics or other areas. But it can be used, like, for example, with the existence of God. Occam's razor is used by both believers and non-believers.
Right.
Non-believers say, hold on a second. The idea that there is some supernatural explanation rather than explanations that fit into the sort of scientific principles that we know, that contradicts Occam's razor. So Occam's razor dictates that there is no God. Believers will say, hold on a second. You're telling me that the explanation for what's around us depends on as yet undiscovered histories that might be partially explained by the Big Bang and this and that. The other hand, isn't it way simpler to just say there's a force more powerful than us, which we call God, that created everything? So Occam's razor can sometimes be sort of used and or misused because Occam's razor can't possibly explain both the existence and non-existence of God.
Right, and I guess people could use Occam's razor as a way to argue that obviously there's a serial killer that's involved in all of these deaths because they all seem to fit a pattern.
Right.
It's a good point that you made.
Yeah. In any case, we're going to continue following it. I will probably make it a point not to be out by myself at night. Not that I make it a point to be out by myself at night walking around.
But you may be able to solve the mystery.
Well, if I live to tell about it.
Okay.
Yeah, which is... all right, that's it for today. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.